if we were making some kind of like business to business, like back end app, like a company uses to track inventory or something like that, compared to a video game, that is a trivial piece of software. Yeah.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 427 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm yet again wondering how it's been
How
so
have we
many
come
episodes.
this far?
Yeah, wow.
That's like 8 years of episodes.
Wow.
9? That's a lot.
It's a shitload.
Anyway, this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry for years, just for decades on end. We just cannot stop talking about it.
We
And
invented
today is
podcasts just to be able to talk about this.
We did. Yeah, we saw a hole in the market. We just jumped right in.
Is there an older podcast than this? No, don't look it up. There isn't
Nope.
one.
Nope.
This is
And
the
there's
oldest
no way to
podcast.
check.
Nope.
Today's August 4th, 2023. And before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show, so get fucking ready for that.
Get fucking jazzed.
If you didn't turn this off as soon as I said warning, then you signed up for that, you know. Also, we'd like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. They went over there and then we just yoinked their wallets right out from under their back pockets. Okay, so thank you very much for that. All right, so we've got some questions to get into today. But first, we want to talk a little bit about what's been going on with Crashlands 2.
Yeah.
So we're getting into content push mode. And we're getting out of systems development mode. But what does that even mean?
What do you mean? Yeah, I think it depends, right? So a lot of studios, a lot of times you'll hear talk of what's called pre-production versus production, right? And the trouble is that those are conceptual things, not real things. And I mean that in the sense
And confusingly named.
Yeah, also confusingly named. And so different studios define those phases of development differently, and there's kind of a very blurry edge between the two of them. So the way we've been thinking about it on our side is that pre-production is the time of more of molten game systems, right? Where you're still figuring out how things hook together, how things loop together. And while it might be the case that you've already figured out what's fun about the game, that's usually just one piece of the puzzle. You got to figure out, how do you extend that fun for X number of hours? How do you then make control schemes that work with that fun on whatever target platforms you're going for? Yada, yada, yada. And then kind of scope your content. And so for us, moving from pre-production essentially actually then sounds like most of development, weirdly enough, like more than half typically. On our side of things. And then production is where you're like, we know what we're doing we know all the big things. And now it's just a matter of figuring out all the small things. So yeah, we have weapons in this game. They work like this. They scale like this over time. We plan to have this many of them. And then it's kind of a question of, okay, well, what are the specific ones we have? What do the specific ones do? That's kind of the movement that we get to. And so this last week, with all of the work we've done with finishing up the boss fights, base systems, we essentially have hit a point where those core systems for the game that essentially need to be in place so that we can answer those other questions about content, scope, and things like that are all firing. They're all good to go. And they all certainly have expansion stuff to do. So it's not like we're done with them, but they answer the bulk of the questions that we need them to answer. And so now we can actually see the whole shape of the game, which is cool.
The whole thing.
And then we could sit down and say, okay, again, all right, here's how armor works. So how are we doling it out over the course of the game? How is it that the player is going to be finding interesting things every 20, 30, 40 minutes while they're playing, and then just kind of plot a course. So we managed to do that this week, which is fascinating, I think, for two reasons. One is that there's a definite, it's almost like when you're designing a game or you're kind of doing this, like a lot of pre-production work, a lot of the format of the discussion is in like, oh, what if we want to do X?
Yeah, there's a lot of it would be cool if conversations.
Yes, it would be cool if. And those are actually, they're great from a high level standpoint in terms of trying to figure out what the edges of your design space, your play space are going to look like, right? So that means like, what if the player can buff themselves? Like just, what if they could eat stuff? What if they could shoot projectiles? Those things. And then you get deeper and you're like, what if the projectiles can also shoot projectiles? What if what if the player could throw traps on the ground? And those traps can shoot projectiles that buff the player and debuff enemies. You start getting into all these layers.
What if being hit by a spike trap causes you to shart out a tortoise that goes on a rampage?
Mm-hmm.
That's a what if.
That's a what if.
Which is actually technically possible for us to do.
You could do that.
In Crashlands 2 with the systems that we put together.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about that is that early phase can go off the rails. And I think, we have our own experience with it.
Yes.
Because you're dealing with not necessarily what exactly, you're basically trying to figure out how to think about what could be in the game based on those fundamental visions of like what the play experience is supposed to be.
Yeah, you're not operating within constraints. You're just exploring an unconstrained space that could kind of go anywhere.
Yeah.
So and then trying to build the suit, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's what we do as we're talking through a lot of those what ifs is we basically say what kinds of tools and game systems would need to exist for us to actually be able to easily deliver on this what if.
Yeah.
Right. So in the case of like, okay, we want to have weapons in the game that the player can wield and use to fight enemies and stuff. Okay, well, can we have guns? Can we have spears? Can we have daggers? Like, what are all the different types of weapons? Like, can we have ones that shock things with electricity? Can we have weapons that stun things or, whatever it is? And then you got to think through all the implications of, you can just hard code stuff. That's always an option. And that's how we always did things in the past. But that means everything has to go through a multi-step process where it's like talk about the thing, agree on it, then the programmer goes off for a while and codes the thing up and then brings it back. And then you kind of talk about it. And then the programmer goes and codes up some changes to it. It's very slow. And so our pre-production phase has been all about developing the game changer and all this tooling to hook all these things up in an easily modifiable interface so that as we are talking about stuff, if we go, hey, we want a weapon that does this, then just like while we are talking about it, we're just adding that weapon to the game and checking the boxes and choosing the properties of the weapon or whatever. And we can, while designing it and while talking about it, we can be prototyping it and testing it in real time.
Yeah. Basically reduces that.
It
reduces that cycle time between the idea of a potential design for the thing and the iteration on that, like the implementation and iteration of it, to essentially just merge it all together. So the discussion is the implementation, is the iteration. And we actually, this has been the Goldilocks dream for us that started the game changer because of the follow-on thing from that, which is that if while you're playing the game, say we do a playthrough in a month or something like that, you start saying, oh, actually we should probably tweak X, Y, and Z. The second part to me of entering production for real is answering the question or basically knowing the answer to the question of how can you change things as you iterate and you get player feedback.
Yeah. How do you balance the game? How do you add features that are missing?
Yeah.
Whatever.
Because if it's one thing to say like, yeah, we can easily add stuff because again, like hard coding allows you to very easily just frankly, very quickly add a thing, right? But it actually works against then that second idea of how quickly can we iterate on something when we get feedback. And when you have those two things, I think, put together, you've really entered a really rich spot for production where now you can actually pick the content you're going to make and put it in, right? And so what I think is interesting about that is this collapse that happens. So again, you start in this place where you say, what if when you dodge, a turtle shoots out of your butt and then it runs on a rampage and then it splits into more turtles over time that just keep on spawning, turtles all the way down sort of thing. Mm-hmm. You move from that space to saying, okay, we need some cool, like a cool class, a cool set of gadgets or capabilities the player has coming out of this particular moment in time in the player's journey, coming out of these resources that fills this hole that we don't have in terms of a play style, right? And it actually suddenly gets very narrow. In other words, like we've done all this work to make it possible for us to do anything very quickly.
And now we have to actually make some decisions about
I think it's important because I remember when we talked about this earlier, we're like, we want to make it so that we can just add stuff super fast, right? And but the reason is not so that you can have infinite stuff.
So you can have exactly what you want and have it fast.
And so you can create a really rich play experience by being able to say, oh, we have a hole here in terms of play style. Here's this whole suite of content that we made and iterated on and delivered already just by having the discussion about it in like a day. And we can see that it's good and it does the job that we need to do. And then it's, okay, now put do all the rest of the fancy stuff, sound effects, art, all the stuff that takes more time, actually. But what's interesting about that is that it's strange to me because it felt like the whole point of all this game changer stuff, the initial point was like, we want to have a lot of things in this game, right? So we're going to need to have a tool that can let us make a lot of things really fast. But the specifics of those things were amorphous, right? And then suddenly, now that we've actually done the work this past week of essentially collapsing a bunch of these things down, it was this realization that like, oh, actually, there's not infinitely good things, if that makes sense. There's infinite things, but there's definitely not infinite good things. And there's also definitely not infinite choices that fill out a really nice, rich play experience, right? There's actually, it's like the melee tank healer sort of build. Like there's these big things that actually very seriously constrain the total space for design in a way that automatically just cuts out like 90% of the ideas.
Boring.
Yeah, most stuff is boring,
stuff
right?
Like for example, we have the ability to make, much like in the first game, we have the ability to make these trinkets, which are items that you can craft or find or whatever. And you've got a limited number of trinket slots, and each trinket has some kind of unique effect to it. Because we have the game changer, it is technically possible for us to make, let's say, 30 different trinkets that all just have varying amounts of stats on them. Yep. Right? This one gives you run speed.
You could make 1,000.
We could make 1,000,000 of them if we wanted to. But they're boring then. It's just like you would just find the ones that have the most of the stat that you like, and then you're done. And so instead, we took the time to make a smaller number of trinkets, but that are actually genuinely unique, that have interesting like reactive properties to them, or that actually add some kind of a sort of like a new resource. So an interesting one that we have is I'm not going to give away all the specifics, but it's that just like when you get hit in combat, you gain this buff, and then there are other trinkets and weapons and gadgets and stuff that utilize that buff as. So it's kind of like we can use items to kind of establish a cornerstone system for some kind of gameplay style. And then if you get more items that kind of go with that, then it expands and opens up. But you can also, mix and match that combo of things with some other combo of things that has its own sort of cluster of interesting properties and play styles and stuff. So it's much different than just like plus 5% run speed, kind of a thing. Yeah. So
it's so different. And I think that's what's been interesting is like putting those together, which literally we did this week. Like that was the thing this week. Put together the first 4 sets of cool kind of conceptualized playstyle gear in the game. And in putting it together, it is that funny thing where it's like you pick a theme, kind of a concept for a thing like, this player is all about, going in and like actually doing the opposite of what you usually do, going and getting hit on purpose. How would we support a crazy thing like that? What would be fun about that, etc. So you do start on that high level, but then you're able to kind of just, okay, here's these things, and then you test it and you iterate on it. And then it's like, okay, we have actually within that conceptual space, there's a very narrow number of things that would be just really interesting to do. Where if you had to answer the question, if I can only pick one of these or 4 of the 6 or whatever that augment this thing, like these are cool choices to make, right? As opposed to like, just it's better because it has more stats on it, which we do. You have to have some level of like growth in like a kind of a boring way, right? In something that's like an RPG.
Well, you can also do both, right? As in, like, you can have some, like, because like games like Diablo, right? I think of like, or basically any loot game, right? I feel like there's chaff, right? Yep. And then you're separating the wheat from the chaff, I guess, right? Yeah. So you're wandering around and you find like almost everything you pick up, like it's just a random stat machine that's definitely worse than stuff that you've got, or it's like similar but not obviously better, or if it is better, it's usually not enough. It's like close enough to a side grade that who cares really, right? But then every once in a while you stumble across these like truly remarkable things, right?
Yeah.
And I think in a more handcraft experience like we're trying to provide, where it's less about RNGesus, right? Giving you buffs from above, right? There is still room for that, like where there's like stuff that isn't as meaningful, and there can be kind of more of it, right? But as soon as you actually do start kind of handcrafting these really interesting, more limited experiences, then it also makes the chaff even less.
Yeah,
there's a good, So it's actually
fall off.
Yeah, so it's actually hard. It's easy to do both when you're purely relying on on randomness, right?
Yeah.
Because then just things will sometimes get so good out of the randomness that like that's what people actually care about. And part of the game is just finding those things. But when you want everything to actually just be interesting, it becomes hard to have a lot of stuff actually, because you can't have a ton of stuff that's also interesting, right?
It's the No Man's Sky problem, right? Where like there's like a billion planets, and then you visit one, and it's just like the last one, also kind of grayish, greenish, and with weird aliens walking around, and that's it, you know. Yeah, and it's all this stuff is pretty difficult to kind of come up with as we're designing things, because it does take a lot of iteration and stuff. But that is kind of like the standard we want to hit, is that as you're playing through the game, you come across something that really kind of piques your interest as something that sounds like fun. Mm-hmm. So you're like one example is we've got the electro fuzz knuckles, which we pulled, which was a trinket actually in the first game, but we're actually going to make it into an actual weapon fuzz knuckles, which is a fist weapon basically that generates static electricity, and then you can use the static to do stuff, right? And so there'd be a moment where like once you become aware, which like different players are going to take different paths, right? So like not every player necessarily is going to come across this concept of these fuzz knuckles at the same point in time. Mm-hmm. But once you see it, even if you don't craft it, like once you see it, you'll know like, oh, that's a thing, right? Mm-hmm. And then as you go throughout the game, every now and then you'll come across like a quest chain that sounds like it's got something to do with electricity and static or whatever. Or you'll just kind of get these little hints, and then you can choose to go down those paths. And the idea for us is like we want to create all these really fun and interesting threads for the player to pull on, and then if they do, when they get to the end of it, they get something that that jives super well with the thing that they are interested in doing in the game, right? And like that just requires handcrafted stuff, because if it's random, then
I think you can also think about this like the difference between, say, Borderlands with its infinite guns. Right? Yeah. And every once in a while you find one that's like pretty amazing for some reason because it like truly stands out in some way. But for the most part, it's just kind of fun, and you just like the sheer number of guns, though, is just overwhelming versus, say, like Half-Life 2, right? Which has exactly one gun per category of kind of gun that you can actually then, because there's not really a level system, right? So like it's like you can just use
that gun, you're good to go.
Yeah, you just use it through the whole game. So then it's like you've got your rocket launcher, you've got your gravity gun, you've got your whatever. Like it's just a small suite of really interesting curated experiences that are more or less appropriate for certain kinds of circumstances, but also just for certain kinds of play styles, right? So that and then you can have a whole gameplay experience where you don't for one moment think, wow, this isn't enough kinds of guns, right? Because each one is just so interesting and is such a fun way to actually engage with the game.
I mean, I remember the B gun in the original Half-Life.
Yeah, original Half-Life has some great ones. Yeah, and again, it's not very many, right? There's not very many kinds of things.
Or 8.
Yeah, but they're just all so interesting and fun.
Yeah, but that's what I'm getting at, which is like there's actually not that many things that are interesting. That's sort of like that's the reality. So it's like we've done all this work to create a thing that lets us create stuff really, really fast. With the original inception being, we need just shit tons of stuff, right? And then once we're able to actually do all the iteration, finally arrive at the place. It's like collapsing the controls onto a controller for a game that you've had in your head for a while, right? It's like there's this reality of there's actually a hard edge to the space, a hard constraint to the space that you can then utilize. Like it suddenly firms up stuff in a way that like it's
very satisfying.
Yeah, it feels very good
because there actually is. Honestly, like we just had a conversation like a week ago where like every now and then at least one of us on the team is suddenly just kind of like starts tripping balls or just like
you're looking at all the work still left.
Like, well, you're not actually. That's the problem. You're not actually looking at the work because you can't, because it's so open ended up until this collapse
you could
point.
make you're looking at turtle shitting device. So oh my God,
you're looking at your own uncertainty about the work.
Yeah, and because there's infinite possibilities, and also like as you're designing the systems, all you're doing is having these what if conversations, right? Mm-hmm. And since nothing is solidified, you're kind of entertaining in your mind all of these things that have been talked about, but haven't actually been that you might do, but you're not totally sure, right? And so you're kind of like trying to hold all this in your brain, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed and try to think like, how are we going to actually do all these things in time, right? And then it's been very weird, because like then this week the entire sort of like wave function, collapses down into a set of really fun and interesting, but now obviously scope limited,
very
scoped
concrete.
things. And you're just looking at it and you're like, oh yeah, this is totally doable. Like, and it's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
So no problem.
Yeah. And I think what's so exciting to me, or what's so weird about that again, is like that it feels like a mismatch, right? Where it's like the whole point was to be able to make anything. Right. And again, this is why I like to think about the two parts of entering production, which is that, you can make anything.
There's a difference between making anything and making everything.
Yes.
Right. So we wanted to be able to make anything. This doesn't mean we are going to then make everything.
Yeah.
We'll just make the interesting, fun stuff, But yeah, it has been very cool to see it all kind of like really solidify in a way where now we can look at it and just know like, yeah, this is going to work, and like that anxiety just kind of goes away. So, very cool, very exciting. And, we'll probably have some more to say about kind of how the content is shaping up in the coming weeks. 'Cause it's going fast now, like really fast. Yep. All right, let's get on to some questions. These questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bsketch.net. The highest upvoted question comes from Disgruntled Pineapple.
Oh no.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So be careful. They're kind of pointy. They're kind of pokey. So don't piss off a pineapple. It's just good life advice. Disgruntled Pineapple says, will Crashlands 2 be available on the MacBook version of Steam?
No.
Certainly not.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And the reason is simply just a business one, which is that we did have Mac support for the original Crashlands back in the day. For
a long while.
time.
Yeah, we pulled it eventually.
And then we pulled it because it turns out, and this is one of those truths in business that you'll see typically related to customer focused stuff, where people say there's 20% of your customers who absorb 80% of your time, but don't produce 80% of your revenue per se, right?
In games, it's more like 99 and 1,
And it turns out that most of the bugs and stuff we were getting were from the Mac side of things, but also the percentage of the purchasing player base was so small on that supporting, like basically saying we can offer you.
It literally was like a 99 and 1. Like 1% of our players are Mac, and like 99% of our bugs are MacBooks.
So it kind of just came down to like, oh, actually, this is just a really bad idea from a business standpoint. Like every time we want to do this, of course, it's the same thing as we talk about Levelhead. We want to do these things because more people playing the game, cool, want to support people on whatever devices they got. But there's a hard reality as far as like if we have to spend time on that, then we can't spend time on other stuff that might affect far more people.
Now, proportionally, like if hypothetically Crashlands 2 hits some level of success where 1% of our players would end up being like 100,000 people or something. At that point,
it's a different
probably worth it, right?
Scale,
different conversation.
Scale changes the conversation for sure. Yeah. But you got to be a little more careful when you're, especially in the indie space, you got to be a little bit more careful with how many things you're supporting and the realities of those business cases, because some of them only make sense at a certain scale. And I think Mac is definitely one of those.
Well, I think like seeing Crashlands, Crashlands, OG Crashlands has really like kept our studio alive for a decade, right? Like it's a successful title by, any reasonable metric, but it's successful for a small studio, right? Like we still almost run out of money several times since we launched Crashlands. And without calling out any specific platforms over the years, because we put Crashlands on a lot of stuff, right? And there's one or two platforms that basically broke even in the sense of the original labor costs of making it so the game would work there and getting it tested and deployed and going through all that stuff, right? Roughly, like in the end, was kind of a wash, right? But now the game is still there, right? And so if future players play it, we still have to deal with like over time the cost just keeps on accumulating, right? And there are other platforms that where we're literally like every 3 months we would get a check for $10, right? Because like a player would be there, right? It's not here. I'm talking about like
just nobody's
storefronts and stuff,
playing.
right? So now, if you imagine like if you still have to now maintain a version of the game for that, whether it's a store or whether it's an operating system, or
adds
whatever,
complexity to everything.
Yeah, and you've got
building.
like 10 players who are doing it, but now everything you're doing is way more complicated, right? It's just doesn't make sense to do it that way.
So I think the thing we learned from both that experience and then with Levelhead, we launched Levelhead on everything also sort of simultaneously, right? Out of the gate.
We didn't do Mac on Levelhead, did we?
We didn't do Mac.
Correct.
But, we did 6 different platforms.
Yeah,
launch,
we did.
Right?
We did all the stores. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of that learning experience there was it's essentially the same thing, which is like, yeah, we can. It's the same as this design thing. At the end of the day, it's like, yeah, we can build for everything, but it turns out that there's actually only a few things where we're at, it makes really good sense to build for them. And then the other ones, if they end up being more of like the reality of having to support having made that build is that we have in-house QA, we pay for testing on everything we build. So in other words, you're scaling up your total costs, right? Then you're scaling up support costs post-launch. And if you have any question about whether or not that platform itself will be feasible for bringing in the amount of revenue, not just to offset, because I guess as soon as you're just in offsetting territory, you should not do it because the added complexity slows down everything else. And this is what we had happen with something like Levelhead, where you get a delay on like a console, for example, because of a certain issue. And now you can't put out your next update, which should coincide with then doing a sale and getting an extra hit of revenue for another, say, 2 weeks or something like that. It's not inconsequential to have the game on multiple platforms because they're not completely independent in terms of how you then manage additional updates, more content, sales opportunities, whatever. And so what we found is that actually we should basically reduce the complexity as much as possible, just to the places where we know will be good.
Yeah,
and
we should only launch on a platform if we have good reason to believe that we're either going to get a shitload of players or if we are going to get a shitload of featuring and support from that platform. Yeah. To give us a chance, or a business deal where there's some kind of a exclusivity or some
sort of a guaranteed arrangement level of success, basically.
Yeah, because it's like if you say like, oh well, people, they're like, you guys remember the Ouya?
Yeah,
remember that?
Yeah.
So like there was a time where like suddenly there was this micro consoles kind of craze because like mobile gaming was kind of taking off and some people thought like, oh well, like what if we made like an Android based consoles, like Nvidia did it with the Shield, and there was the Ouya, and like there were a bunch of these things, and I think we actually worked with one of them for Tower Fight. The Game Stick.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and like this was way back in the day. So they gave us what, at the time was like a crazy amount of money.
I think it was like $5,000 or something, wasn't it?
It was less than that. It was quite a bit less than that, but it was more money than Telefight had made at that point.
Yep.
And so we were like, yes, we could like double our earnings. And so we put it on there, and I'm pretty sure we got like 2 players or something.
Yeah, no, there's no.
Yeah, and this was just like a common thread that we saw over and over again. It's like there are all these different, and sometimes you'll even launch on a major platform, but just because of the way that platform ecosystem works or whatever, you end up not getting the featuring you need, or whatever the case may be, and the game just kind of languishes there, right? And so. But like Adam was saying, you got to maintain it still. So now, with your 2 players on that platform, every time that platform releases an OS update, you've got to deploy a patch and stuff. And so then the other kind of issue is there's this kind of like feedback loop, which I think Mac in particular suffers from, which is like Mac is not a bad gaming platform. It's just it's the same as a PC in terms of like the form factor and everything. But there's a population problem, which is there's not enough people gaming on Mac for a lot of the major engines, GameMaker included, to be aggressive about keeping the engine compatible and supported on that platform. And so because it's harder for developers using these middleware engines to make games for those platforms, like Mac becomes a worse gaming platform because there's not that many games available for it, and therefore fewer people buy it for gaming, and it just creates
the whole supply chain is because we're on the very most downstream side of the supply chain for making games, right? As in like we make a game, right? and then we sell it. But everybody upstream of us is operating under exactly the same, market reality of like Mac users just not being very prevalent in the game space, right? Yeah, there are certain spaces where they're like if you're like in web dev, like one of my frustrations as a person, like so like I have to be a Windows programmer because we make games for Windows, right? But in the web dev space, like everybody's a fucking Mac user, right? Just everybody. And so like there's all these amazing designers. There's all these amazing designs tools and web tools and like cool new things that people are coming up with all the time. New browsers even, right? That are just Mac only. Because even though that's a tiny segment of the overall population, when it comes to like web dev, that's your paying customer base. Actually, it's basically
a professional niche, basically.
Yeah, the professional niche. Yeah, but for games, it's exactly the opposite. Right? It's just
Well, and I even saw apparently the Steam Deck, which is great. I got one. It's amazing.
It's a Linux machine.
It's a Linux machine, but that kind of does some kind of Windows emulator kind of thingy, basically.
Valve with its infinite resources has put over literally decades has been investing heavily into making it so that Linux can be a gaming platform, but for Steam specifically, right? They're like, they're building layers on top.
And they've done it.
The way they did it was not by saying, here's new tools that you can build and deploy to Linux with. They said, take your Windows build and we'll do some bullshit.
Yeah, they'll just make it work.
To make it work. Yeah.
Which is the right move.
100%.
But interestingly, even though the Steam Deck is pretty new, it was like a year old or something. Linux has now outpaced Mac in terms of player population for Steam games.
Just because of the Steam Deck?
Just because of the Steam Deck. So like that should
right?
kind of tell you like, So like a brand new device appears and within a year it is overtaken this, 5 decades old OS Mac, right? So like it's just not that many Mac users, and as much as as always, like there are things we want to do, and then there's things that are actually
a good idea,
smart to do, and feasible. And like as much as we want to put our games on everything and make them available to everybody under all circumstances, but man, like the realities of that really slap you in the face.
Well, and I think the way that I think about this now, because the way that we used to think about this was like just kind of be on everything, right? Which is kind of similar to what we're talking about the game changer stuff. Where like the way we were kind of thinking about it was like be able to make anything, right? And we've switched how we think about that to the idea. And this also is related to the idea of like scalability as a business, right? Which is that people confuse scalability with thinking that scaling is the point, right? So that like you're supposed to be growing, when scalability is actually about making it so that everything is in a position where if you needed to scale, you could, because that's already good, right? And it allows you to adapt to whatever's happening, because scalability actually really means adaptability, right? And I think of platforms, whether it's a operating system or a store or whatever, the same way, which is we still want to be technically able, right, to deliver to Mac, to deliver to every console, right?
Exactly.
But we don't necessarily want to do it just because we could, right? The fact that we can is what allows us to be adaptable, so that as the market conditions change, if we or manage to secure a deal from a new business partner, if it's whatever happens, we don't have to have all of our eggs in one basket. Like we're not Windows game developers, right? We're game developers that then make the game work wherever it makes sense from a business standpoint to do that. And similarly, like when we're designing the control schemes for things like the control input mechanism for Crashlands from the very beginning was like, we need to make sure that touch, controller, keyboard, and mouse are all going to work for this design the whole way through, so that as control schemes, right? Because that's like the dominant thing about whether or not you can get on a platform, basically, is if you fit the form factor. And so we handle the stuff that like is definitely going to be a problem if we don't when it comes to cross-platform, because the rest is like technical details of integrating with that system, right? Which is usually not about the game design. It's usually about very low-level stuff, right? Yeah. And so as long as the game itself can just kind of be played on anything, then we've done our due diligence when it comes to making sure that we're ready for the good side of diversifying where we're actually deploying the game. But yeah, that lesson, as you guys are saying, the lesson we learned was that it gets very frustrating to when you have a game out that's been out for a while and it's on a platform that literally sells a copy every 2 months, and then you have players complaining to you, like your 5 players on that platform are complaining to you because the version you have on there is out of date by a few versions because that same platform doesn't have an automated pipeline to allow us to upload stuff, or because they've made some change that our engine doesn't support, and like there's no incentive for us to push on
nor our engine maker
to make a change for that because there's no customer base there, and they would rather put the resources into something else. We would rather put the resources into something else, and now all of a sudden you have to, right? And you can get really bogged down by committing to things as a person or as a business that in the long term are going to end up just being a cost. And so we got to avoid doing that.
You got to be careful. All right, next question comes from TimConceivable, who says, does Copilot learn from your code? If so, doesn't using it risk leaking your proprietary code to the public?
There are two. So for the first answer, that it's kind of a yes and a no, as in like Copilot itself learns from your code, but Copilot, like for your own co-piloting experience, doesn't meaningfully learn from your code. As in like, it's not learning specifically about your code and then helping you specifically with what it has learned, right?
Well, and importantly, Copilot will learn from our code because it's on GitHub.
Yeah.
Right. Like Microsoft uses the code on GitHub to train Copilot.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, Copilot learns about everybody's code and then helps you with yours, right?
Yes.
And
yeah. So
yours is
whether
a tiny
we
piece
were
of the training set.
Yeah. And whether we were actually using Copilot on our machines or not, it doesn't matter because if we're using GitHub, then Copilot's going to be learning from our code.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure.
How does it handle the proprietary information problem then?
So there's stuff. So when you're using GitHub, there's also different, like there are some options you can choose, which are basically how efficacious it's going to be because of whether or not you're returning information back, and also whether or not you're getting access to like all of the information that's available, or trying to more carefully avoid proprietary stuff, right? And that's an actively changing space because nobody's really sure what to do about that scenario. So the short story there is that there is some risk about like the stuff that you're doing becoming like part of a training set somewhere, right? I don't worry about it too much because of the kinds of stuff that we're doing. If we were working on like a security field, or if we were dealing with essential like private user information or whatever, right? Then I would be extremely hesitant to.
Yeah. So in other words, you would be flagging those repos in a way that made it so that they wouldn't use them in the data set because you can't.
Yeah. So private repos aren't included in the data set. It's only public things, and basically like GitHub attempts to do due diligence to say like, okay, it's a public repo, and they automatically parse like the licensing files and stuff that are in there, right? To try to decide if the thing actually is open, and then uses it if it is, right? In principle. Because of the nature of open source stuff, which is any fucking rando can go like fork a Git repository and be like, well, now here's my copy. And they could just like change the license file, which doesn't mean the license is different now, because that's not how licensing works, right? But it looks like it's different now to a robot who isn't going to like know how to track the origin of like where all this stuff came from. And there are certain pieces of code that have been around for a long time. That's like, here's the function that everybody uses to solve X problem or whatever, right? There's some, and those things then appear wholesale in like thousands of public open source repositories, right? Even though technically that piece is like, that's an actually invalid. So people are already using this stuff in an invalid way, which is why the robot ends up using it in an invalid way, right? So there's a lot of like really interesting nuance and layers of complexity here. I can't remember the details of how Copilot is handling the fact that it's like looking at your code in the moment, and then it is submitting aspects of your code to the APIs that are doing all this stuff, right? To Microsoft, and then Microsoft is returning stuff back, and then it's integrating that into the editor. So it has to, in order to work, it has to be taking snippets of your code constantly and sending them to somebody else, right? So at some point I looked into like how much I was worried about that fact, and the conclusion I came to for our circumstances was I'm not worried about it. But I don't remember exactly how it all shakes out.
Well, and also like, let's say somehow through Copilot, somebody ends up exactly recreating our Cake Frames code or our Game Changer code, right?
Yeah.
I don't give a fuck.
But also,
you still got to make a whole ass game around it.
yeah, but also the
Maybe
way
that's the
like
protection, right?
Well, I think that's exactly it. That's my sense of how this stuff works is that like you can't use these tools to like just make a game, right? As in like you can't be like Copilot, make me a game and it just spits something out, right? You're still piecing together small bits of things at a time, and the way that it works, it's a statistical model, right? It's not trying to like copy paste things wholesale. It's basically trying to find the statistically most likely given something. So
it doesn't have exactly your code. You're just like ready to copy paste into somebody else's project.
Yeah, it would if that showed up. So this is like the case where you do see like the very public things where it's somebody who's usually like been coding for 70 years, right, or whatever, who's like, I was the one who wrote this GPL3 code for this like specific algorithm or whatever, and I managed to get Copilot to just spit out that whole ass like function or class or whatever, right? And the reason is because that piece of code is statistically likely in a whole, because that thing is already available in like a million places everywhere.
There's like millions of people have already taken that. So it's not really new.
Yeah, so the AI doing it doesn't jeopardize the security of this thing that already exists in millions of places.
So basically, the way I see it is that given that all of our stuff is proprietary, it's all locked down on GitHub and stuff. It's not open source. So our code like wholesale isn't in these training sets, right? Little snippets of it as we're actively doing stuff like probably end up adding to in the system, right? But in this very kind of just abstract kind of statistical way where the end result for me and for our use case, I'm just like,
it's not gonna matter.
There's nothing that can hurt us meaningfully about this process, right? So I mean, I worry more about things like if you open up a file that has like your actual secrets in it, like your API keys and stuff, right? Then those things could get submitted and stuff. But I also know that they're attempting to do obfuscation work. It's like they're trying to detect things that look like random strings and that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
And automatically change them before they get sent off. And like, this is stuff that we also do. Like
you're scrubbing.
Yeah, like in our logging system, for example, right? Like so we have server logs for everything people do on our systems, and I'm really aware of like people don't want their data just sitting on our server somewhere, right? Like I wouldn't. So we try to find ways to make it just very low likelihood that we're going to create a problem that somebody would be upset about. And so to do that, I do a few things. One is we just hold the data for 30 days because that way it's long enough that if we have questions that we need to answer, we've probably got the data for it. But it's short enough that like it's not likely that any given piece of data is going to be there for very long. And then I also just have these various steps that I go through where I just like look at all the data that comes through and I'm like, does this look like an email address? If so, rip it out, right? Does this look like a random string? If so, change it to something else.
I don't want it.
Yeah, I don't want it because that might be a secret, right? And so I think Copilot's doing similar kinds of stuff. And while I don't just like blanket trust, GitHub or Microsoft or whatever, I know that these issues are extremely sensitive and they have put themselves in a very precarious situation by interacting with people's data in this way. And so I kind of trust the net effect of them operating at this scale with something like this, where where they have to really pay a lot of attention and be really
basically if they fuck it up, they're going to fuck it up on
badly.
such a level that
it's class action lawsuit time.
Yeah,
now we get to go get $100,000 from Microsoft or whatever, right? Like, still not.
So that's
great.
Still a win.
Yeah, still a win. And again, it's because like the net effect on us because of what we're making, which is video games, right? And because of how this stuff works, is like it's just there is no world in which the outcome of them getting some of our code information is that like somebody beats us to the launch of Crashlands 2. That's not a meaningful.
Yeah. If we were making some kind of like business to business like back end app, like a company uses to track inventory or something like that, compared to a video game, that is a trivial piece of software.
Yeah. But even still, you're not going to get that wholesale out of.
But importantly, it's like a single function piece of software, right? That like just the amount of code in it and what it's doing is pretty tightly constrained, right?
Yep.
Whereas like I was saying before about the video game stuff, it's like it's not just code. Like we have like web code, we've got cake frames, we've got the game changer stuff, we have all these independent game systems, we've got libraries for handling inputs and all this stuff. And even if you had all those things, like Adam was saying, you'd still have to make Crashlands 2, right?
You can't do anything.
And we have all of them. And when I go into the code, I have the whole fucking code base just right there, right? And when I'm trying to figure out how it works and like move between things or whatever, it's really fucking hard, right?
There's like
really
130,000 lines of code in this program.
And it only works wholesale, right? Like you can't just copy paste like two of the scripts out of Crashlands 2 and be like, okay, cool, these will work now. I can just
even 90% of it you can't take.
Yeah,
and still
I would
have
bet
it.
you that there's
all
like
of it.
there's almost no one file in like the whole Crashlands code base that you could just take and it would be sufficiently self-contained that it would work and do something useful, right?
Or if it is, it's just some kind of basic ass utility.
Yeah, it'll be
thing,
something
like,
very simple. Yep.
Yeah.
Everything else is just so networked and like integrated with each other that you have to have the whole game for it to work at all, or nothing, right?
Yeah,
it costs
and
you
all of the all the data.
Yeah, like Seth, imagine if imagine a horrible world we lose all of our data except for a random half of the files for Crashlands 2, right?
Yeah, I'd just start over.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. It's not even worth trying to make that to piece that back together. It's just not possible.
Yeah, if there was a Thanos snap of our code,
it's just half gone.
It's all gone at that point. So. All right, final question comes from Suavignon, who says, "I recall, perhaps incorrectly, that it's good at it's good to admit. Memory sucks.
Yep.
I recall, perhaps incorrectly, that publishing Levelhead resulted in the studio developing some kind of pipeline type mechanism that slings content onto different platforms with relative ease. And I therefore assume that the, for now, Netflix/Steam only plan for Crashlands 2 is purely commercially motivated, or is Switch/Xbox/other just not a viable option for getting eyeballs at this stage, pipeline or otherwise?"
So we kind of addressed
the first question,
earlier. Yeah, but I think more, if you want to get into kind of the specifics of it, the reality as far as discovery goes on, let's say, the mobile and Steam in particular storefronts, is that both of those platforms have had to handle such a large volume of games for so long that the discovery mechanisms, while definitely not perfect, and certainly while Steam, I think, in this avenue has a huge leg up on even the mobile space.
Yeah, Steam to me is the only good algorithmic platform for discovery.
Yeah. The reality is that all of the consoles are basically new to having shitloads of games on them from independent developers, and as such have varying levels of support algorithmically and as far as their storefronts go for making it so that if you have a good game, this is the whole idea, if you have a good game and you market it pretty well, can it actually just sort of go once it starts going on one of these platforms? And what we found over the years is that it's like basically a really high level, is that Switch was really good before Nintendo had most of its sort of first party content rolling out, right?
Yeah.
Back when there were fewer things on the platform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there were fewer just everything, right? There was not very many titles, not very many first party titles. It was just,
it was new.
It was like the early days of Steam, right? Where like every year 12 games would come out and you would just buy all of them because
they kind of called it the blue ocean versus red ocean hypothesis, right? Like blue ocean is like, it's totally open. You can go anywhere, whatever. Mm-hmm. Red ocean is, it's now full of sharks and everybody's been eaten and it's just blood in the water, right? Like, don't go in there.
Yeah. And so Switch is an interesting one because, again, like the cost of participating on that platform is actually relatively high, right? You have to do
very high, yeah.
Console cert. It has its own weird fucking controllers you got to deal with, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, the cost of developing for that hardware and operating system, like added on to it's very, very high.
And optimization is very hard too because it's a 7-year-old platform at this point. I'm pretty sure, or 8. 2015.
It was weak hardware when it came out. Yeah.
When it came out, it was $300, and it was about the equivalent of like a mid-tier Android phone 8 years ago, right? So like optimizing, I am amazed at some of the games that are coming out on Switch with like how they've managed to keep them running above 30 or like even at 30 frames per second.
The level of like hardcore engineering talent that's going behind making these titles work is just
and in so many cases
we don't
it's
have
actually
it's
titles that are only on the Switch, right?
Yeah.
Like Tears of the Kingdom and stuff, right? Like
first party stuff.
It is like a big reason why these Switch exclusive games take so long to develop is just those engineering challenges of getting it optimized, right?
Yeah, tremendously challenging. So I think the unfortunate thing you've seen in the Nintendo space is that because a lot of developers most of them are gamers, right? So a lot of indies in particular harbor a kind of nostalgia and a love for Nintendo that I think has made them easily fall prey to the idea that like it's just good to be on the Switch. It's not if it implodes your studio or costs you a shitload of money and time when you don't have a lot of money and time to go around, right? But the problem is that there's this really intense nostalgia kick, I think, for people, and this idea of being.
It feels prestigious.
It feels prestigious
to launch on a Nintendo console.
Yeah, and like if you value it for that purpose, then just be very explicit about that. That's what you're into there, because the reality as far as that market for indies go is it has been very challenging
really
for
seems
a number of years now.
Collapsed.
Yeah,
in a lot of
and
ways.
this is not like new knowledge. You could kind of Google around and see some horrific sales numbers from people. So on our end, it's one of those things where again, it's like we're not interested in essentially it's a scale problem, just like the Mac thing, where it's like we know that if you have a game that's already done really well and then you put it on Switch, it'll make some money. That's fine, right? Because there's already like a level of awareness, there's a level of success for it, and you can then sort of roll that into getting some additional featuring or whatever else on the store. Switch has no ability for you to surface your games aside from setting them to basically $1 once the game launch is done. I'm not.
Have they cracked down that yet, or is that still the only?
They have not. I think it's still just the same fucking thing. So you don't have
see
options.
indies are constantly putting their games on like really steep sales on Switch because it is literally the only way to get people to see it.
Yeah, and so there's all these things like that then on the Switch ecosystem that make it just not a good idea until we have either some assurances or until the game has already launched and we're like, oh, this is again it's a proportion thing. This is very, very successful. It'll obviously do just fine over there, and we don't have to worry about the sort of long-term cost issue. And then Xbox is interesting, I think, mainly because the primary value for us is looking at something like Game Pass, right? Just having a huge volume of players is super useful.
Because as a store, it's not that different from Switch, right? As a hardware platform, it's not nearly as weak, right? So it can, it's easier to
build for, and all their build tools are actually way better. So it's like as far as if we were going to pick a console, I would pick Xbox because their cert takes like a day now. It's like it's very slick.
That's the thing is any console does still have that cert process, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind
iOS,
of like
right? It's
iOS does too. Yeah. So in those cases, it's kind of like once you start getting onto a platform that inserts itself into your deployment pipeline with some kind of manual evaluation or approval process, that's where it's like you have to have a really, really good reason to fuck up your pipeline that badly to go onto that platform. Like there has to be a guarantee of some big money to make your life that much worse.
And then again, it's people just don't think about the maintenance and the cost, right? Because it's not just the upfront development cost, which can be very high to get a thing working on a platform. It's that every single change then that is made to the game that gets deployed at some point has to be evaluated in all these. That's what QA is, right? It has to be evaluated in all these different contexts to see what happens. And that means that it's like on Switch, if you're just always hovering around like the device's max capabilities, right? Yeah. Then that means every single design decision that you make for the game that you're making has to include the question of, will this run on Switch or do we need to add some more engineering time to make sure that we can get it running on Switch, right? And so now you basically balloon the cost of every single decision that you make for whatever your like platform, your strictest platform requirements across all the platforms that you're on, right? Is you basically take all of the strictest ones and that's now collectively your set of requirements that you have to hit. And those can get really fucking tight the more platforms you're on.
I'd say for Levelhead, Switch especially probably consumed about 20% of our development time.
Yeah, it's no joke. It's really no joke.
In terms of all the hardware and cert requirements that we had to hit, right?
Mm-hmm. Even now, if we want to put out an update for Levelhead, it's going to have to go on the Switch also, right?
It still has to go through that pipeline.
Yeah, it's going through the pipeline, and so the amount of like the testing complexity, right? Because if you're just like thinking about this, right, like we have way more QA than any team of our size. Like we're pretty abnormal, right? And actually, on that note, we should say congrats to Carl, who's been a longtime part-time QA, who's now full-time QA as of a couple weeks ago. So congrats to Carl. But part of the reason for that is exactly this stuff, right? We're like, we need just a fuckload of testing all the time. And when it comes to like, if you look at like Jordan, our lead QA, like if you look at his desk setup, or who's our platform specialist who makes sure we can build for everything, right?
Dudes are just covered.
They're just covered in devices, right? And they have to have all this like arcane knowledge about, okay, I want to test this thing on this thing. So that means I have to like log into this sandbox version and use this like test account to be able to do this thing. And then to communicate with their team to say, oh, hey, by the way, like this is what's going on with this build. I have to like go to this weird web portal and log in with these credentials, this other one with this other set of credentials. Like the amount of like weird shit that has to happen to test these things or just to get them published. That's after we've done all the development work, right? It's just outrageous. It's just so much. Versus Steam, where you just sling your build onto Steam and you basically did it, right?
Well, I think the lesson to me here that we learned was that like they're basically especially when you're starting or if you've just been on Steam or just on mobile, where essentially because it's easier to get on and because there's basically no wall at all, there is a prestige element associated with the consoles or a nostalgia element associated with Nintendo.
And I think iOS too, right? iOS has that like sense of like
there's a bit of there's some that like it's harder to do
quality bar sort of thing.
And you have to, because I think the question's interesting, right? Because it's the framing of purely commercial. Is this a purely commercial decision? It's hard to know because basically, I guess the way I put it is every decision that we made in the past that wasn't purely commercial, when it comes to the scale of this kind of a decision on the impact of the scale
was when we were.
I'm not even kidding. Yeah. And bad in a way that like depending on how our cards could have fallen, the fact that we did it could have caused the studio to blow up. And I'm not even kidding about that. Choosing to support, say, Switch in the case of Levelhead, choosing to like build for Mac for Crashlands when we had barely any capacity for doing anything or testing. Like there's all these things that you do because of a different reason that's not actually based in any commercial reality that, well, I guess the Levelhead one's a little bit different because we had support from them and whatever. But like you're doing these things where it's not just I've looked at the business case, right? Which it's true to some degree that you do need to, you can't just be on only the thing that is like a guarantee and not take any risks and stuff like that. But there's qualified risks to take. And I think it's basically we've learned the qualifications associated with various platforms over time.
Yeah. Well, the risk isn't just you don't make money. Right. And
correct.
It's that you continuously lose money on maintenance and time and,
Yes.
Launching onto a platform is the beginning of a whole bunch of stuff. It's not like the end point of development.
Yeah, well, I guess it's the first end point of a bunch of other stuff that people don't think about, which is like keyway devices, form factored problems, and like all of the engineering problems that go into that.
Yeah,
and that's so you can get it out the door, and then once you get it out the door, now you have the next indefinite phase, which goes forever, right? Like, which is people now have bought this game. What if only one person did?
Yeah. So now we're kind of in an interesting flipped position compared to where we used to be, which is like now we want to be on as few things as possible while still reaching as many players as possible. Yeah. Right. Because
but still while being able to be on as many things as possible.
Just not actually. Because again, it's about that, like I was saying, scalability, meaning like our ability to expand versus do we actually do it? And the answer to that second question is just based on the cost benefit analysis, right?
Yeah, I would love to have it on Mac because so many people I know like only have a Mac device, right? And I want them to be able to play Crashlands too. Totally. But that's not a sufficient business case until there is a strong enough business case. Then I can be like, fuck yeah, we can do this. And like, I would love it to be on Switch. Switch is a great platform. It is so fun to play stuff on Switch, right?
Oh yeah, it's great.
But until there's a business case there, then we just have to say, I mean, as much as we would love to.
But it will be supported on Steam Deck, which is a big fat Switch. So that's okay.
Yeah.
You got options.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's some weird thing about this framing, which is I share it. I understand the basically pointing out like that isn't purely a commercial decision. Is just like
I think. Well, I would say it's okay. Like,
well, I mean, like it's. But what I'm trying to point out is like we cannot survive making non-commercial decisions. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah. Well, I think there's a spectrum here, right? because there's doing
purely
business,
commercial versus
and so I think
partially.
I think this is where there's a lot of confusion that people have, but also like a lot of the
Vitriol.
Yeah, a lot of the way that people think about this, about running a business, is that running a business is like you see as sort of inherently evil. Therefore, and there's truth. Like running a publicly traded company, I think, is inherently evil because of the design of how publicly traded companies work. Right? There's no way around it. It's the outcome of that is basically evilness, right? But that's not synonymous with running a business. Like, is like the coffee shop down the street evil because publicly traded companies are evil? You know, like it's not really how that stuff works. And any company at any point like is trying to make decisions about what to do, and there's so many things that go into it that it's a company. Its decisions are commercial. That's that's sort of by definition, right? But any given decision they make can have a short-term negative impact on the bottom line because they're trying to offset that with a longer-term positive impact, or vice versa, or because they just think it's a good thing to do and they don't have shareholders who will sue them into oblivion for doing a good thing, right? And so like in our case, we definitely we optimize for our own experience day to day doing the work because we're trying to do this for the long haul. Yeah. And we have to keep ourselves from burning out. We have to be able to make enough money to pay ourselves and our staff. And again, for the long haul, so we all have enough certainty that we know we're at least in this for another few years before we don't know what's going to happen, right? And so from a business standpoint, like that's basically what we're optimizing for, is having a good work experience, right? But we're also trying to make for the product that we're making while doing that, we have goals of like having as many players have access to these as possible. Like we want our games to be accessible, played by lots of people. Like we don't want there to be barriers in the way, right? Both of those goals, these internal goals of our own satisfaction and these more public goals of like the stuff that we make and the outcome that it has for people, are constrained by just the reality of what it means to be doing this stuff, right? And so we're constantly in this push and pull of, we would love to do this, but X, or we would love to do this and we think we can get away with it, so we're going to do it anyway, right? So everything that we do
too as a project, right, was like the original, like one of the original founding ideas with it was like, we have a successful IP out there. Let's do a number 2, right? Yeah. Which you could argue again, purely commercial. But then the way we decided to do it was not, let's just do a repeat. It was, let's rebuild everything we've ever done about how to do everything.
Let's make what we wish we had made for original Crashlands, given now that all the skills and stuff that we've developed.
Let's do a sequel with a capital S, which turns out to cost a fucking lot of money and time.
Yeah. So we're going to end up spending 4 years of between 6 to 8 people's plus some part-timers like time, right?
That's a college degree right there.
Yeah. For a whole bunch of people, right? Yeah. We're sending like 8 people to college basically, right? To make this game. And we could have tried to like constrain it down and say like, oh, it's just a raw ass sequel. We're gonna do this in like 2 years and just squirt it out the door or whatever. There's all kinds of stuff that we could have tried to do. But we also think this was the best commercial decision. Even though it's going to take twice as long, right?
Is it one of those ones where it's like, that's why I have some friction against that framing, because it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's too, it doesn't have enough nuance, basically, right? Of the question of like, there's no such thing as a purely business or purely personal decision when you're doing business.
It's always both.
Because it's always both, right? Yeah.
You can't take your own personal preferences and ideas out of the conversation, but also you can't ignore the fact that if you do literally whatever you want, you just run out of money and die, right?
But you also don't know what's going to happen, right? So also because the other thing, the idea of like a purely commercial decision means that like you can see what will happen if you do X, and even though X is bad for a whole bunch of reasons, it's the best commercial move, right? Which is a very rare thing that could possibly even be true, because how could it be really bad but also good, again, unless you're a publicly traded company. But it also means that you know what's going to happen when you do that, right? To make this like purely like, I know it's going to happen, so I'm going to do that. Like that's not an actual feature of the world for anybody. You don't get to make decisions that way. And so what we're all doing all the time is saying, given the huge breadth of unknowns and then the holistic kind of experience that we're having, like running a business and living in this space, right, is how do we choose what happens next in a way that to the best of our guess, right, is going to maximally satisfy all of the constraints and goals that we're operating under, and
Commercial and otherwise.
yeah, commercial and otherwise. And I think like it's like work-life balance. It's like it's better not to say, well, I have work and I have life, and those are things I'm trying to best. But the question is, how do you integrate these things together so that they become all part of the puzzle?
Work-life integration.
Yeah,
not balance. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question. It's complicated. There's a lot of considerations that go into things, and we're always trying to do our best to get our games to as many people as possible, in as accessible of ways as possible, while also not, screwing ourselves over. Yeah. And making sure that we have a good development experience as well. So, and that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And we'd also like to thank everybody who has wishlisted Crashlands 2 thus far. It's picking up steam on Steam. Mm-hmm. It's really moving. So if you haven't done so yet, help us out, juice the algorithm, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. We really appreciate that. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.